Welcome tonight. Welcome to Campfire Stories, and this is your host, Clay Steele. You know how we do this. We come on in and we sit around the fire and we enjoy one another's company and tell stories and visit with our friends. Now, we've been around here for a while and always enjoyed campfires, and glad to be seeing a lot of you now for the last almost 2 years. We've told each other a lot of stories. Now, some of these stories have been around for a long time. Some stories are new. Now, this story that I want to tell you tonight is about a prospector that lived in Alaska. Turn of the century, 1900, so 100 plus years ago. That'll make you wonder if the creature he calls devils weren't possibly close relatives of today's Bigfoot. Now, this is titled The Strangest Story Ever Told. The author is Harry D. Culp, was a prospector in Alaska at the turn of the century in an area known as Thomas Bay. His stories of the mysterious devil creatures he encountered in that region have been told over and over around sourdoughs, campfires, and they've become part of the legend of the gold country. Now, so it was with great excitement that Mr. Culp's wife discovered the original manuscript of The Strangest Story Ever Told just a few years after the author's death in 1950, and chose to share it with the world. Now, Thomas Bay is located to the northeast of Petersburg in southeast Alaska. Baird Glacier drains into the bay, which is also known as the Bay of Death, due to a massive landslide that occurred in 1750, obliterating a small Tlingit native village and claiming the lives of more than 500 people. Then, sometime slightly before the year 1900, a ship carrying Chinese immigrants hired to work in the Alaskan salmon canneries wrecked just outside of Thomas Bay. It was reported that all souls were lost. In the early 1900s, this region also earned the nickname of Devil's Country, after several prospectors claimed to have encountered or witnessed devil creatures, alleged to be a form of bipedal, ape-like humanoids, such as what we know as Sasquatch or Bigfoot today. Then, in the June of 1900, Harry Culp, visiting Thomas Bay for the very first time, was told by a prospector named Charlie the strangest story ever told. The prospector, who had canoed alone into the Bay of Death, told Culp and his companion that he'd found gold-rich quartz in Thomas Bay, but he'd never prospected. And then he told him why. In his own words, "Swarming up the ridge towards me from the lake were the most hideous creatures. I couldn't call them anything but devils, as they were neither men nor apes, yet they looked like a combination of both. They were entirely sexless, their bodies covered with long, coarse hair, except where the scabs and the running sores had replaced it. Each one seemed to be reaching out for me and striving to be the first to get me. The air was full of their cries, and the stench from their sores and bodies made me faint. I forgot my broken gun, and I tried to use it on the first ones. Then I threw it at them and turned and ran. God, how I did run. I could feel their hot breath on my back. Their long, claw-like fingers scraped my back. The smell from their steaming, stinking bodies was making me sick, while the noises they made, the yelling and the screaming, big breathing, drove me mad. Reason left me. How I reached the canoe, it's a mystery to me. And when I come to, it was night, and I was lying in the bottom of my canoe, drifting between Thomas Bay and Suki Island, cold and hungry and crazy for a drink of water. You no doubt think I'm crazy or lying. Never let me hear the name Thomas Bay again, and for God's sake, help me get away tomorrow on that boat." Who or what were these terrifying devils? Some thinks that they were the Tlingit devil, the half-man, half-otter Kushtaka. Others insisted that they're Alaskan relatives of Bigfoot. Many people dismiss the story as simply the imagination combined with maybe drink or time alone of a prospector who'd spent way too much time alone in the bush. And here is the story in his own words. Chapter 1. The spring of 1900 found 4 men batching together in a shack at Wrangell, Alaska. All 4 were broke, as is usual with prospectors. As luck would have it, I was one of the 4. For reasons which will be quite obvious, I'll just call the other 3 John, Charlie, and Fred. Now, Charlie came into the shack one night in April, all excited, and said, "Fellas, I've been on the trail of an old Indian for the last month, trying to get him to tell me where he picked up a piece of gold quartz he has at his camp." Now, I never said anything about it before because, well, I wanted to get the story from him first, and today he spilled the beans. He told me to go up to Thomas Bay and camp on Patterson River on the right side, travel upriver for about 8 miles, and then turn to the high mountain. And after traveling about 1.5 miles, I would find a lake shaped like a half moon. Plenty of gold quartz up there, he said. Well, of course, a prospector is ready to stampede on a whisper of gold any place, and we were no exception to the rule. So we all talked the matter over, and finally it was decided we would send Charlie to look the prospect over. While he was gone, John, Fred, and myself would hustle work somewhere for another grub stake and to pay the old one off. The beginning of May, Charlie loaded his outfit into a canoe and left Wrangell for Thomas Bay, which lies, well, northwest, about 50 miles. He had 3 months' supplies, but was to come back sooner if he'd found anything. But if he didn't show up in that time, we were to put out a search for him. Well, John and Fred took a contract to get out wood, and I got a job in the Wrangell sawmill. Things went along until the first part of June, when on a Sunday in the late afternoon, we all being home, in walks Charlie, without coat or hat, and looking as if he'd just been through hell. He didn't give us any greeting whatsoever, just heaved a piece of quartz over into a corner of the room and said, "Get me something to eat, I just want to rest." The poor feller sure looked it, and after he'd eaten, he turned in without telling us a thing about his trip. Well, we picked up this piece of quartz in the corner, and it sure was a pretty thing to look at for a prospector. It was all shot through with gold specks. Were we excited? I say we were. Now, just before dark, we 3 walked down to the beach to bring up Charlie's outfit, as he had come up to the shack with only that piece of quartz in his hand. But there wasn't a thing in the canoe except his oars. Charlie slept all that night. We had hard work getting Charlie up for breakfast the next morning, but when he did roll out, he just ate, he borrowed a coat and a hat, and he left the house without saying a word or even answering one question out of the many put to him by us. We were all pretty excited and feeling ourselves ready to make a fortune, so we did not go back to work that day, but sat around passing that blamed piece of rock back and forth to each other while we talked, and waited for Charlie to come back and make his report. Believe me, we were anxious to hear it. Now, late that afternoon he came in. He said, "Fellows, the SS Drigo will be on her way south early tomorrow morning. Can you give me enough money for a ticket to Seattle? I'm through with Alaska and I never want to see it again. I'll tell you about my trip to Thomas Bay and where I found that quartz. But my advice to you is to forget all about it. It'll never do you any good, and it'll only cause you a lot of mental and physical pain. If we were not partners, I would never open my lips about this trip or what I found. But if you will all promise never to mention my name in connection with what I'm about to tell you, or mention the name of Thomas Bay to me again, I'll give you the story. Judge for yourselves as to my saneness, because this is the most astounding thing you ever heard. As far as I'm concerned, it's beyond me to reason out. Don't ask any questions to prolong my story any longer than it takes to tell it, as I want to leave Alaska and forget it if I can. Well, this is Charlie's story. The first night after leaving Wrangell, I reached Ideal Cove. Next night, I reached Muddy River in time to make camp. And the third night, I hit Ruth Island in Thomas Bay. And that's where I spent the next day looking up Patterson River for a suitable place to camp, which I found about a quarter of a mile up from Tidewater on the right-hand side, looking up the river. I broke camp on Ruth Island the next day and moved up to the place I picked out the day before. I put up my tent, packed up my outfit, and left the canoe on the riverbank. The next day I spent cooking beans, cutting wood, and making things comfortable for a long stay. As it looked like rain, I wanted to get things fixed to keep dry. Yeah, well, it started to rain that night and just kept it up for days. I lost track of time, as each day was just like the ones before. I had nothing to read. I was all alone, couldn't do anything without getting soaked, and the roar of the river and the wind through the timbers just about drove me bugs. So I put in most of my time just trying to sleep. Finally, the weather broke, and I got out. Spent several days in trying to find the old Indians' Half Moon Lake, but I couldn't spot it. And about 2 miles from camp up the river and about a mile from it, I did find a lake shaped like the letter S. On the creek coming out from the lower end, I panned some pretty good colors, but as figured, not enough to get excited about. Yet it was an indication of gold in that country. Talk about dead country. That sure is. There doesn't seem to be any life in there at all. You might spend all day in the timber without even seeing a squirrel. Now, I was getting tired of beans and rice and bacon, so I made up my mind I would go over to a ridge about 8 miles from camp, about 2 miles east of the S Lake, and get a few grouse, as I thought I could hear a few hooters up there when I was at the head of the lake. I left come next morning, which was a fine sunny day. I took only the rifle with me, and when I come to the ridge, sure enough, there was a few grouse a-hooting. I shot 2, and had gotten them when I bagged another one, which fell down the ridge about 100 yards before it hung up. Well, on my way down to pick it up, I found that piece of quartz right there. Now, up to that time, I'd paid very little attention to what the country I was in looked like, as it was so heavily timbered and brushy. The formation didn't show up, and I had no tools with me to uncover it. The top of an old snag had broken off and fallen, scraping the top moss and loose dirt for a space of about 8 feet wide, 18 or 20 feet long, uncovering this quartz ledge, which is where I found this piece. Now, the ledge was worked smooth by a glacier at one time. I couldn't find anything to break off a piece with, so I used the butt of my gun to get that piece right there. And in so doing, I broke the stock of my gun, thus ruining it for further use. Now, this didn't worry me any, as I knew there was no game in that country larger than a grouse, and damn few of them. My first thought was of the richness of the quartz and of you fellas, and getting back to town to round y'all up so we could get busy on it. After looking it over and enjoying the feeling and knowing I had made a rich find, I covered the ledge up again with moss and limbs and rotten chunks. After finishing that job, I thought I would climb the ridge directly over the ledge and get my landmarks so I could come back to it again or tell you where it was if anything should happen to me. And this I did. I climbed straight up over the ledge on the ridge until I reached the top, which was about 600 feet above where I found the ledge. Now I looked down below me. I picked out a big tree with a bushy top, taller than the rest and about 50 feet to the right of the ledge. Looking over the top of the tree from where I stood, I could see out on Frederick Sound, Cape of the Straight Light, the point of Vanderput Spit, and turning just a little to the left, I could see Sukhoi Islands and the mouth of the Wrangell Narrows. Satisfied with all that, I turned half round to get a backside on some mountain peaks, and lying below me on the other side of that ridge from the ledge was that Half Moon Lake the Indian had told me about. Right there, fellers, I got the scare of my life. I hope to God I'd never see her through the likes of it again. Swarming up that ridge toward me from the lake were the most hideous creatures. I couldn't call them anything but devils, as they were neither men nor apes, yet looked like both. They was entirely sexless, their bodies covered with long, coarse hair, except where the scabs and the running sores had replaced. Each one seemed to be reaching out for me and striving to be the first one to get to me. The air was full of their cries, and the stench from their sores and their bodies made me faint. I forgot my broken gun and tried to use it on the first ones, where I just threw it at 'em and turned and ran. God, I did run. I could feel their hot breath on my back. Their long, claw-like fingers scraped my back. The smell from their steaming, stinking bodies was making me sick, while the noises they made, yelling, screaming, and breathing, drove me mad. The reasons left me. How I reached that canoe or how I hung on to that piece of quartz is a mystery to me. Now when I come to, it was nighttime, and I was lying in the bottom of the canoe, drifting between Thomas Bay and Suki Island, cold and hungry and crazy for a drink of water. But only to satisfy the latter urge, I started for Wrangell, and here I am. You no doubt think I'm either crazy or lying, and all I can say is, there's the quartz. Never let me hear the name of Thomas Bay again, and for God's sake, help me get away tomorrow on that boat. So passed Charlie from our lives. We dismissed his story as a fantasy caused by loneliness and morbid thought. Chapter 2. John and Fred were the next ones to go. They left in the latter part of July of the same year. Now, I still stuck to the sawmill, so we would all have a little cash for the winter if nothing showed up otherwise. They took the outfit with them because they figured if they found that ledge, they would stay and get out as much of the rock as they could bring into town. Fred took the canoe and John took the sailboat. They were gone for only 3 weeks, however, when they both come back. Fred had nothing in his boat, and John had only about a quarter of the outfit that they had taken with him. Neither one had much to say about the trip, except that they hadn't found the ledge. Fred borrowed some money from me, and the 1st of September he beat it for the States. Just before he left, he and I were by ourselves in the shack, and he told me this about Thomas Bay. Harry, now I believe that gold is there, as Charlie said. I also believe that he didn't lie about what he saw, because I had one of those devils setting on the bow of the canoe from Thomas Bay to Horn Cliffs, and he cursed me for stopping every time I tried to take a rest from paddling. My advice to you is the same as Charlie gave us all. Just forget it. If you do find it, it'll never do you any good anyways for a number of years. As for Thomas Bay and what it contains, I hope and I pray I will never hear of that place again, let alone see it. Fred left me and has never come back. I hear from him quite often, but he never said a word about coming back in. After Fred left, John told me his story, saying he didn't feel like mentioning it while Fred was here. He said it took him 3 days to get to Thomas Bay and another day to find Charlie's camp up the creek. Everything was in it just as he had left it, but was damp and moldy. They made their camp close to Charlie's and saved what they could of his outfit. They had about 6 days of good weather, and in that time they found only the S-Lake Charlie had spoken of. Then it had begun to rain, and they spent a couple days in camp. Getting impatient on the 3rd day of rain, they decided that they would separate. John was going to climb a mountain which was about 7 miles from camp. After breakfast, each took his chosen route. John climbed to the top of the mountain, then looked out over the sound and picked out the very landmarks that Charlie had spoken of. Looking down below him, and a little to his right, he spotted that half-moon lake. On the coast side of it, there was a ridge about 600 or 700 feet high, and beyond that were several ridges and hills of nearly the same height and appearance. And a little to the left of this hilly country lay the S-Lake, and it was in this hilly country that Fred was headed. Now, on the side of the lake near John was a big tundra flat with a few scatterings of small jack pine growing. John was getting cold from the wet since it was still raining, so he started back for camp by way of the lower end of the half-moon lake. About halfway down the mountain, he heard 3 shots in quick succession. Now, wondering what the shooting was about, as there was nothing larger than a woodchuck to shoot at, he started making it as fast as he could to the tundra flat. As he neared the flat, he thought he saw Fred down on his hands and his knees trying to pull up a little jack pine with his teeth. Every while he would stop and make a noise like a dog barking. John took off running towards Fred, who was now on the edge of the timber, and called him by name but got no answer. He got closer and asked again, "What's going on, Fred?" He got no answer. Finally, he shook him and asked him what he was doing. Fred looked at him with a faraway look in his eyes, and he said, "Is that you, John? Have you got any matches? I'm trying to build a fire, but I've no matches. I'm so cold I can hardly move anymore." John asked Fred if he had done the shooting and where the gun was. No answer. John walked back out on the tundra where he had first seen Fred. John said that the place was dug up in small holes for quite a distance. Several small pine trees were pulled up and scattered around. And to one side of the dug-up area was Fred's gun, stuck down in the tundra up to the hammer. He pulled it out and found one empty shell in the barrel and 3 loaded shells in the magazine. He went to Fred, who was still squatting on his haunches, and he says, "Here's your gun. Come on, let's get back to camp. It's getting late." Fred agreed and said, "All right, John. If you can find camp and help me to get there, I'll go. But if you're just trying to scare me and fool me like the other devils, you can go to hell. I'll stay here where my fire is and where it's warm." Well, John told him there was no fire, that he was wet, cold, and delirious, and needed to get back to camp as quickly as possible. Fred got up stiffly and walked slowly, but the further he got away from the tundra, the quicker his steps became, until he was finally running as he got closer to camp. They reached camp after dark. John rolled Fred up in blankets, started a fire, and made supper, calling Fred in to eat. Now, after a silent supper, Fred went outside and hollered to John. "John, the devils are coming! Run!" Fred took off running towards the boats. Well, John listened, and he thought he heard the sound of padded feet. He got scared. He grabbed up a few of the old blankets, a little grub, and the gun, kicked out the fire, and left the rest of the camping gear right there. He headed for the boat, shoved off, and pulled like hell away from that place. He couldn't see Fred, who had a pretty good head start on him. He got as far as Horn Cliff, and he saw Fred about a half-mile ahead of him. He took up his gun, and he fired one shot into the sky to attract Fred's attention. By the time that John had reached Fred, he saw that Fred was in a state of delirium. He was laughing like a fool, and said one of the devils had jumped into his canoe, and he had shot him. John asked Fred where his gun was, and Fred said he'd thrown it over the side as there was no more shells in it. Chapter 3. John went to Nome the next spring, and I went up the Stickeen River. 2 years slipped by again before we saw each other. In the summer of 1903, we took a trip to our old camp to get the tools we had stored away. We took a hike to find the Half Moon Lake, but couldn't find no sight of it. Next day we tried again. We failed. The country all looked alike. There were just so many small ridges and valleys and bluffs that we just got mixed up in them and would fool away the whole day trying to get somewhere. I tried a compass, but could not get it to work. There were large deposits of magnetic iron in the area that interfered with it. As we had 6 to 8 miles to walk from our camp, we decided to pitch camp near the S Lake. Now, the next day we found the Half Moon Lake. Going around the ridge side, we found the formation exposed, and upon examining it, discovered that it was a highly mineralized skirt. I took my compass out of my pocket and it jumped right at the hill showing magnetic iron. Both John and I got an eerie feeling that we was being watched. Now I couldn't help looking up and around me every few minutes. We started noticing the bushes moving, but we couldn't see anything. It still left both men with unease, and they decided to head back to camp. That night, we were awakened by an odd sound, a half squeak and half moan, which seemed to be only a few feet away from their camp. The noise of small branches being broken can also be heard. I sure was scared. Every hair on my body stood on end, and cold shivers ran down my spine. I sat up in bed, grabbed my gun, and threw a shell into the chamber while I listened. Gradually, my senses came back to me, and pumping out the loaded shell, I put the gun down and flopped back to bed, saying, "John, you damn fool, as long as you've been in the woods, can't you tell a porcupine song while he eats?" "Porcupine hell," answered John. "There ain't any around here. You know we haven't seen any in this country. Well, there was no more sleep for him that night, and just as soon as morning came, we broke camp and started back for Wrangell. So ended that chapter of the story. Now, John is still in Alaska. We often get together and go out on a trip, but never will he go to Thomas Bay again. Chapter 4. For the next 3 years, I knocked around different parts of Alaska, but I always had in mind to make one more trip to the Devil's Country, the name I gave the district. I decided I lacked the nerve to go alone, and whenever I told interested parties the story, they always backed out. So there I was one night in Petersburg. Now, that was a new town in 1906. I dropped into a saloon that had just been opened by a man from the States. During the evening, over several drinks, the saloon keeper and I got to be fairly friendly. I told him I was a prospector and had been all over southeastern Alaska. He told me about a dream he had had before he had ever thought of coming to Alaska, and his dream was as follows. I took a ride in a boat and went to a large bay. At the head of the bay there was a big river, which I followed until I came to a glacier. Then I walked over to my right, around the foot of the mountain and into a country all broken up with small ridges, little canyons. I got lost in my dreams, wandered around for a long time, finally finding a lake shaped like the last quarter of the moon. On one side of the lake was a big flat, and on the other side there was a bluffy ridge which I followed down to the lake till I came to the outlet. And I followed that down till I came to another lake which looked like half of it would make a last quarter moon and the other half a first quarter moon. So I was standing there looking at it and wondering about its peculiar shape when I woke up. This dream struck me as very strange, for he had described the Devil's Country about as well as I could. So I said, "You know, I know where that place is, Mr. Bush." "You do," he said. "Well, you show me that place and I will show you $1,000,000. So we agreed to go just as soon as he got somebody to attend his place. Mr. Bush and I left one evening in July on a motorboat he had chartered for that trip. Next morning, after a hearty breakfast, we went ashore in the dinghy. He carried a rifle and I carried the gold pen, prospecting, pick, and some lunch. Mr. Bush is a large man of nearly 200 pounds, but he was short-legged, making traveling pretty slow. The day was warm and sultry without a breath of wind. We was nearly there, and while rounding the bluffy point of one of the ridges, he looked at the bluff and he said, "Culp, I've seen that bluff before. Just over that next ridge ahead of us is where that lake lies." "Yep," I said, "you are right, Mr. Bush. If I'm not mistaken myself, this is the last hill that you will have to climb." "Well, let us up and at it," he said. "I'm anxious to see if that lake is really there and if it looks like it did in my dream. If so, our troubles are over, and we will have plenty to see us through for the rest of our lives." Well, we started up the hill, which was around 500 or 600-foot climb. I was leading the way and setting the pace as before, and had gotten about halfway up when I heard a noise behind me. I turned just in time to see Mr. Bush rolling down the hill a short bit, fall up against an old log, and lay still. When I got to him, he was on his back with his eyes open but rolled back, so that only the whites were showing. Believe me, I was sure in some pickle if anything was wrong with him. 7 miles from the beach, all alone, and with a 200-pound man to get out of the timber, that's no joke. He wore a felt hat, so I picked that up together with his gun, which lay just a short ways from him, and went down to a little creek below us. Then I filled his hat with water, climbed back and poured it on his face, his hands, and his chest, raised his head and his shoulder, and propped them against the log. I was just going after another hatful of water when he rolled his eyes back, and a bewildered look came into him. I said, "Well, what the hell's the matter? Are you going to croak?" "Is that you, Culp?" he asked weakly. "Take me out of here, will you?" "Sure I will," I said, "but you're going to have to walk. The streetcars aren't running, and you're too heavy for me to pack." I broke open the lunch. I told him to eat a bite, and then we'd start back if he wanted to go. He ate a little, then he got to his feet. I did likewise, handed him his gun, and we started out. When he came to the little creek, he stopped and began calling me everything he could think of. He said I wasn't taking him out at all, that I was taking him up into the hills to kill him, etc. I reached over and I took that gun from him, pulled out all the shells and put them in my pocket. He never said a word about that or even tried to hang on to that gun. When I had emptied it and handed it back, he took it just as meekly as you please. I started down that creek, and he followed along for a bit, and then he began the same thing over again. This time I was angry, so I says to him, "Look here, do you see that creek?" "Yeah," he said. "Do you see which way it's running?" "Yes." "Are we going the same way that creek is running, aren't we?" "Yes." "Well," I said, "that creek is running out to the beach where our boat is, isn't it?" "No, by God, it isn't," he shouted. "It's running uphill, and you're taking me back inland to kill me, you—" We argued all the way back to the beach. Never do I want such an experience again. He got into the dinghy, and we rowed out to that motorboat. And when we got on that boat, he lay down at once. I hauled up the anchor, started the engine, and headed for Petersburg. It was a calm, clear night, and when we were nearly to the town, Mr. Bush got up and asked me where we were, in just a natural tone of voice. I told him that we were at the mouth of the Narrows, and then I asked him what he had meant by his actions and abuse that day. I desired an explanation. "Culp," he said, "don't ask me. I will only lie to you. One thing is certain, and that is, I hope I never have to go into that bay again." Chapter 5. 2 more years went by before I got the chance to go up there again. In August of 1908, I left Petersburg in a small motorboat with supplies for quite a stay. I was going into that country and going it alone this time. I had to pull my courage up to its highest pitch to force myself to go. But on the other hand, I felt as if, for my own satisfaction, I had to see what was there: gold, devils, or insanity. Arriving in Thomas Bay, I anchored the boat, took the dinghy, and rowed around looking for a suitable place to put the motorboat on the beach at high tide. I found a nice little cove with a good level beach, and just sat back in the woods a piece. I noticed there was a tent. I yelled, but no one showed up, so I went up to it and found the flaps tied. I opened them up and went in because I wanted to see if I could find a name or anything to indicate whose camp it was, and if I knew that party. And as soon as I stepped into the tent, I could see that no one had lived there for quite a while. The blankets was throwed back as if someone had just got up, but they were damp and moldy, and so was the foodstuff. A slab of bacon hung by a string from the ridgepole, and it was all moldy. Nearly a full sack of flour stood in the corner. The mice had eaten into it, and that too was moldy. A pair of size 10 shoes was covered with mold, as were the used dishes and the cooking utensils. A .30 caliber U.S. rifle was pretty badly ruined. Some clothes hung over a line in the tent were moldy. Outside the tent, an axe stood by a tree, but there was no tracks of any kind around the tent or on the beach, showing that no one had been there since the last rain at least, and that was about 3 weeks past. I figured by the looks of the tent and the stuff in it that no one had been there for at least 6 weeks or 2 months. I could find no letters or reading matters with the party's name on it. The only thing around was a tide table with the month of June marked off up to the 14th. The bed in the camp indicated that the owner was only one man. Pulled into the edge of the timber and covered over with pieces of bark to keep the sun from it was a double-ended, round-bottomed boat about 16 feet long and painted at one time a very dark green color. Well, I fastened the tent flaps again just as I'd found them, rowed back to the motorboat to think matters over. Finally it was that I decided the best thing for me to do was go back to town and report the case, as it was quite evident that the man was lost somewhere in the hills. The tent showed that he hadn't intended to stay away long, or he would have covered up his stuff to keep the mice out at least. Well, I beat it back to town and I investigated the situation. No trace of the missing man was found, and all that was done by the authorities was to leave a signed note in the tent stating that the owner was to report to the marshal's office in Petersburg as soon as possible. The party never showed up. Another unsolved mystery. Now, running into that deserted camp and the disappearance of the lone man in that section of the country Wiped out all ideas of my going in there alone. Chapter 6. Another 3 years rolled by before I made the next and last trip into the Devil's Country. It was 1911. I told this story to a big husky Norwegian, and at the finish, he was all set to go. I had a log cabin in Brown's Cove, where I was living at that time, and by walking overland from there 18 miles, we could camp on that half-moon lake. We fixed packs for each of us of about 60 pounds. We arrived on the right side of that lake at about 3 p.m., having made good time. We picked out a place to camp at the foot of the lake where we set up our tent. Everything fixed up for the night, we turned in. What passed through Ole's mind, if anything, I don't know. I think he was tired, and I know I was. Everything about this place came to me while in bed. I thought of the devils and of Charlie and of Fred barking like a dog on this very same flat that we were camped on, of John and the porcupine, of Mr. Bush and of that unknown man whose camp I'd found. My nerves were strung to the breaking point. Fear had me in its grip. Finally, my overstrained muscles relaxed, and I fell asleep. I woke in the morning feeling fine bodily, but with that old dread of the place upon me, and that everlasting inner voice bidding me to leave before something happened. I cooked breakfast, mixed up a flapjack in the gold pan, and when the coffee was on, I yelled at Ole to get up and come to eat. He had gone down to the lake to wash, and when he come back, I asked him how he slept. But he never said a word, not even good morning. Thinking that he was one of those fellers who didn't like talking before breakfast, I said no more. Now that was my first time out with Ole, so I was not used to his peculiarities. After breakfast, I turned to Ole and I says, "Well, Ole, what will we do today? Take that gold pan and prospect for colors, or shall we take the pick and shovel and see what we can find out about the formation around here?" He just looked at me for a short while, took the pipe out of his mouth, and said, "Vell, Harry, I think we better go out again. I don't feel so good." Knowing what I did know about this place, I said, "Out we go then," and we broke camp right away. I took him back to Petersburg. Often have I asked him why he didn't want to stay, and he tells me that we spent 2 weeks there and prospected the country around the lake and all the ridges and found nothing. Well, maybe we did, but if so, I am the one who was out of my mind because I don't remember a thing about it. Chapter 7. It was 1914. I sent 2 men there, telling them nothing about the place other than the whereabouts. I wanted them to prospect. One was half Russian and the other was a Japanese. They made the trip in all right and found the lake. They camped near it. One of the men used a shovel turned over with a round side up for a pillow, while the other used a gold pan. In the morning, the shovel had disappeared, and during the day one of the men fell over a small cliff and hurt himself pretty bad. So they had to come back to Petersburg saying that they'd had enough of the place. In 1919, I sent 3 other men there to prospect. They came back in a couple weeks. One told me that they'd never gone to Thomas Bay. One said that they were in Thomas Bay but hadn't gone to the section in which I'd sent them. The third man told me they found everything as I had described it and had done lots of prospecting but couldn't raise a color. Now, which one of them told the truth? Another strange tale was told to me by a pretty reliable person, one who would have had no objects in lying. This party had a dairy farm on the Muddy River about 16 miles from the Devil's Country. He said that an old trapper came and camped on the river about 1 mile from his place during the winter of '25. Now, this trapper ran a trap line up Muddy River as far as he could travel in one day, and then pitched camp and ran several shorter lines from that base. Later in the fall, he ran a line into the S Lake. In the meantime, he had found some free milling quartz on a ridge and had planned to wait until spring before going in to find out just how big that ledge was. One day in February, this trapper came to the ranch again and said he'd had a very funny thing happen to him. He had been trapping and prospecting all his life, but he had found the most peculiar tracks on the S Lake trap line. He'd been setting traps and all kinds of sets to catch the beast, but all he got was snap sets. He had therefore taken up that trap line. Now, that very night it snowed about 6 inches. During the night he heard his dog bark and he thought he heard it howl. Then it seemed to run away, barking as it did. And in the morning, no dog in sight. He thought it seemed odd because the dog had always been around camp in the mornings, no matter how much he roamed at night. He couldn't have got caught in a trap because he was trap-wise. He took the dog's trail and followed her just a little ways from the tent when he came to the same strange animal tracks following the dog's. The dog and the strange tracks were all mixed up for about 500 yards. Then the dog's tracks disappeared, and only the strange tracks went on. He stood and he studied the tracks. He could make no sense of them. The dog tracks were going along, and there was the strange tracks going right after him. In some places, the mysterious owner of the tracks had stepped into the dog tracks and covered them, showing that it was behind the dog. The dog tracks showed that the dog had been running, but when they ended there were no signs of a struggle. It looked as if the dog had just vanished or been picked up clear from the ground right in the midst of its steps. The trapper, after looking the ground over, decided he would follow the strange animal tracks to see where it had gone. If he could find its den or where it stayed, he might get a shot at it and see what kind of animal it was. So off he went. The tracks went in a big circle, and after a time came back to where the trapper had taken them up at the place where the dog tracks left off and were following the owner. Twice they went around in the same circle, but no sight of the creature could he get. He began to think that this was no place for him. So he went out to the farmer and asked what kind of animal was in that section of the country. Its tracks were about 7 inches long and looked as if they were a cross between a bear and a man's. You could see claw marks at the end of the toes, toe pads and heavy heel marks between toe pad marks, and heel marks with a short space where the foot did not bear so heavily on the ground. As if the foot was slightly hollowed or had an instep. It looked as if the creature could and did walk sometimes on all fours and at other times only on its hind legs. The farmer told him he knew nothing like that had ever been seen or heard of around here. He himself had seen nothing like that in the 10 years he'd been in the part of Alaska. The trapper went back and disappeared. 3 weeks after that, his outfit was found. Traps on the trap line were in various positions, some set and others sprung, but no trace of that trapper was ever found. Well, that's kind of an interesting story. And well, what about the strange behaviors of the men who visited that area? Kind of strange, ain't it? Well, it's said that large amounts of arsenic were alleged to be present in the watershed at Thomas Bay. Now, that may or may not serve to explain the strange events reported by the visitors. Kind of is one of them stories that's just a mystery. Do you want to go up there and take a look? Oh, or do you have an interesting Bigfoot story to share with us? I would love to hear it. You can email us at thehiddencorners.story@gmail.com. That's all lowercase, all one word. And maybe we'll get to share your stories next time we're here around the campfire. I look forward to it, folks. Until then, this is Clay Steele. Good night. Hey folks, Clay Steele here. You know, I spend a lot of time outdoors around this here campfire. If you're like me, you get downright annoyed by all those pesky mosquitoes buzzing around. They're just looking for a free meal. Nothing ruins a good night under the stars faster than slapping and scratching at bites. And that's why I keep the bee itch stop. I keep it handy. One swipe and that itch is gone. No more burning, no more scratching, just good old relief. Made right here in Nevada with all natural ingredients. It's safe for the whole family. So if you're tired of being a mosquito buffet, do yourself a favor and get you some bee itch stop today. And this is Clay Steele. Watch out for them bugs.